Most people notice their vision slipping and immediately assume the solution lives outside their body. They sit in a chair, stare at a chart, accept a stronger prescription, and walk away believing the problem has been handled. But nothing about that process addresses the actual decline happening inside the system that produces your vision. What is weakening is not just clarity. It is coordination. It is muscular balance. It is the ability of your eyes to move, adapt, and respond to demand. And like any system in the body that is not used fully, it begins to shrink in capacity without announcing itself. Loudly at first, it starts subtly, a little blur, a little strain, a slight delay in focus. And then one day, you realize you are relying on something external just to see clearly. What almost nobody tells you is that this process is not purely inevitable, it is heavily influenced by how little you challenge the full range of your visual system every single day. Your eyes are not passive lenses, they are active structures, driven by muscles that respond to demand or deteriorate without it. Modern life has reduced that demand to a narrow, repetitive pattern. You look forward. You look close, you repeat that cycle for hours. Screens dominate your focus. Distance rarely changes. Your gaze rarely travels to its extremes, and the muscles responsible for those movements slowly lose their strength and elasticity. What feels normal is actually a reduced version of what your vision is capable of producing, and that reduction continues quietly unless something interrupts it. Which brings us to the first intervention, the one that most people underestimate because of how simple it appears. The horizontal sweep movement done at full range without moving your head. Seems almost too basic to matter, but that assumption is exactly why it works so effectively. You are forcing your eyes into positions they have likely not visited in months or even years, pulling them to the edge of their natural range, where resistance lives, where stiffness has developed, where neglected muscle fibers begin to wake up. As you move from one extreme to the other, slowly, deliberately, you will feel tension, sometimes discomfort, sometimes a strange pressure that most people interpret as a warning sign, but it is not a warning. It is feedback. It is your system revealing how restricted it has become. Over time, that resistance begins to dissolve, the movement becomes smoother, the discomfort fades, and something subtle starts to shift. Your peripheral awareness expands your ability to stabilize. Your gaze improves, and the sense of strain that once appeared during normal tasks begins to fade. But here is the part that most people never connect. That tightness you feel is not isolated to comfort. It directly affects how well your eyes receive the resources they need. When surrounding tension compresses the structures of the eye, even slightly, it influences circulation and fluid dynamics inside the system. And when that improves, clarity follows not instantly, not magically, but progressively in a way that feels almost surprising. The real question is whether you will continue long enough to notice it, because most people stop right before the change begins to compound. And just when you think this is enough, just when it starts to feel easier, something else begins to surface, something deeper that most routines never touch. And that is where the second exercise changes everything. Now consider what happens beneath the surface, where you cannot feel direct movement, where structures operate without conscious awareness. The internal environment of the eye depends on flow circulation and subtle mechanical interactions that are almost never stimulated. Intentionally, most people rely entirely on passive processes, assuming that as long as they avoid damage, everything will maintain itself. But that assumption ignores how responsive the body is to even small inputs. When gentle vibration is introduced correctly, not as pressure, not as force, but as controlled micro-movement, it sends a signal through layers that are otherwise difficult to influence directly. This is not about pushing on the eye. It is about creating a wave that travels through surrounding tissue, encouraging movement where stagnation may exist. When performed with precision, using minimal contact, supported by bone rather than soft tissue, the effect is immediate for many people. There is a noticeable shift in clarity, a slight sharpening of detail, a sense that the visual field has become more defined, and while it may feel temporary, at first repeated exposure builds a different kind of response, one that improves how efficiently the system regulates itself. The key here is restraint. Most people apply too much pressure too quickly, thinking more force equals more benefit. But the opposite is true. Excess pressure introduces risk, while subtle vibration introduces change safely, effectively, and consistently. Over time, this practice complements the first exercise by addressing what cannot be stretched directly. It supports internal balance, enhances fluid movement, and reduces the kind of tension that does not present as pain but still limits performance. What becomes interesting is how quickly people notice changes, not just in vision, but in how their eyes feel less heavy, less strained, more responsive to shifts in focus. And yet, even with these two elements in place, something is still missing, something critical that determines how well you adapt between distances, something that quietly weakens with age and almost nobody trains properly. And this is where most routines fail because they treat focus as a straight line, when in reality it is anything but linear. And what happens next will change how you approach it entirely. Focus is not a fixed action. It is a dynamic adjustment happening constantly, whether you are aware of it or not. Every time you shift your attention from near to far, your internal system recalibrates, altering the shape of your lens to maintain clarity. And when this ability begins to slow down, people assume it is gone for good. They accept that holding things farther away is just part of getting older, but that belief ignores what is still functioning beneath the surface. The muscle responsible for this adjustment does not simply stop. Working, it becomes underchallenged, understimulated, and eventually inefficient. The traditional method of training it involves moving an object closer and farther along a straight path, which does create some engagement, but it limits the complexity of the stimulus. When you introduce circular motion while maintaining focus, everything changes, because now the system must adapt not only to distance, but to position orientation and continuous variation. The demand becomes multi-directional forcing coordination between internal and external mechanisms at the same time. This is where real improvement begins, because you are no longer isolating one function. You're integrating multiple layers of control as you move your target in a slow, controlled circle, maintaining the clearest. Image possible, you will feel the effort increase not as strain but as concentration, a kind of engagement that most people have not experienced with their eyes before. And as you reverse direction, adjust distance, and continue the pattern, the system begins to respond more efficiently, the transitions become smoother, the delay in focus shortens, and the sense of control improves. But here's the critical part. None of this matters if you do it once or twice and stop the entire benefit. It comes from repetition, from consistency, from embedding these movements into moments that already exist in your day. Because if you rely on motivation, you will fail. If you attach it to routine, you will succeed. And the difference between those two approaches determines whether your vision continues to decline or begins to stabilize. The path forward is not complicated, but it requires something most people avoid: discipline applied in small doses every single day. And the real cliffhanger is this: what happens if you ignore it for another year? What happens if you continue the same patterns expecting a different result? Because by the time the decline feels urgent, the system has already adapted to a lower baseline, and reversing that becomes exponentially harder than preventing it in the first place. Most people move through their day without ever questioning how little variety exists in the way their eyes are used. You wake up, reach for your phone, focus inches from your face, then transition to a screen, a dashboard, a television, repeating the same narrow visual pattern for hours without interruption. What feels like constant use is actually limited use, because the range never expands, the demand never changes, and the system never receives a reason to maintain its full capability. Over time, this creates a silent imbalance. Certain muscles become dominant because they are used constantly, while others fade into the background, not because they are unnecessary, but because they are ignored. And when imbalance sets in, performance follows the same path, declining, not all at once, but gradually, until it becomes noticeable enough to react. The problem is that by the time most people react, they are already deep into a pattern that has been reinforcing itself for years. The good news is that patterns can be interrupted, but only if you understand where the weakness actually exists, and most people misidentify it completely. They assume the issue is clarity alone, when in reality it is control, coordination, and adaptability working below the surface that have begun to erode. And unless those are restored, any improvement will always be temporary because the foundation remains unstable. The second phase of correction begins when you stop treating your eyes like fixed instruments and start treating them like responsive systems that adapt to how they are used or not used. The vibrational technique you learned is not just about immediate clarity. It is about restoring internal movement where stagnation has quietly built up over time. Think about how rarely anything stimulates the deeper layers of the eye without force. Most actions either involve focusing or shifting direction, but very few introduce controlled micro-movement that encourages internal flow without strain. That is why this method feels different when done correctly. It is subtle, almost effortless, yet the response can be immediate because you are activating something that has been dormant, not through intensity, but through precision. The mistake people make here is expecting dramatic sensations, something obvious, something powerful. But the real effect is quiet. It is the absence of resistance, the slight improvement in sharpness, the feeling that your eyes are working with you instead of against you. And if you rush through it or apply too much pressure, you lose that effect completely, which is why control matters more than effort. As this becomes part of your routine, something else begins to change. Your tolerance for visual fatigue starts to increase. Tasks that once felt tiring become easier to sustain, and the need to constantly adjust your focus begins to decrease. But just as this improvement starts to build, most people hit a plateau. Not because the method stops working, but because they have not yet addressed the third layer of the system, the one responsible for how quickly and accurately your eyes adapt to change. And this is where things become more complex. Now imagine a scenario where your eyes are forced to respond to unpredictable movement, not just forward and backward, but in continuous variation, where distance and direction shift together. This is where the traditional approach breaks down because it isolates one variable at a time, while real-world vision demands simultaneous adaptation. When you introduce circular focus tracking, while maintaining clarity, you are placing a demand on the system that mirrors real visual challenges more closely than any straight-line exercise ever could. At first, it feels awkward. Your focus slips, the image blurs slightly, and your instinct is to stop. But that moment of instability is exactly where growth begins, because the system is being pushed beyond its Pravichnyi pattern into something unfamiliar. As you continue slowly controlling, the movement resisting the urge to speed up something begins to recalibrate. Your eyes start anticipating the motion rather than reacting to it. Your focus stabilizes more quickly, and the lag between adjustment and clarity begins to shrink. This is not instant, and it is not dramatic, but it is measurable if you pay attention. The real shift happens when this practice becomes automatic, when you no longer think about it as an exercise, but as something you do without effort, attached to moments that already exist waiting in line, sitting in a car, pausing between tasks. These small windows become opportunities, and over weeks, the cumulative effect becomes impossible to ignore. But here is where most people make a critical mistake. They focus entirely on the exercises and ignore the conditions that support or limit their effectiveness because no system improves in isolation. It responds to the environment it operates within. And if that environment is working against you, progress slows regardless of how consistent you are, which brings us to a factor that is rarely discussed, yet influences everything you're trying to achieve. Your body does not rebuild or adapt without the resources required to do so. And this applies just as much to your eyes as it does to any other part of your system. When the necessary components are missing, improvement becomes limited, not because the stimulus is ineffective, but because the response cannot be completed. Think about it. Like this, you can create the perfect demand through exercise. But if the internal environment lacks what is needed to support, that demand, the result will always fall short. One of the most overlooked elements in this process is how deficiencies quietly influence visual performance without presenting obvious symptoms, until the decline becomes noticeable. By then, the connection is rarely made and the cycle continues uninterrupted. What makes this particularly important is that many people assume their diet is sufficient, because they are not experiencing immediate problems, but subtle knocks accumulate over time, affecting systems that require constant support to function optimally, including your vision. When levels drop below what is required for maintenance alone, let alone improvement, the system compensates, but only up to a point. After that, performance begins to decline, and no amount of surface-level correction can fully counteract it. This is why some people follow routines consistently, yet see minimal change while others improve more rapidly. The difference often lies not in the method, but in the internal state, supporting it. And just when you think you have identified all the variables, another layer reveals itself, one that connects behavior, stress, and long-term function, in a way that most people never consider until it starts affecting more than just their vision. And that is where the next shift happens, because what